Hello everyone, I'm Elena Cotos and I'm an associate professor in the Applied Linguistics and Technology program at Iowa State University. I also serve as the Associate Dean for Professional Development and the Director of the Center for Communication Excellence in the Graduate College. I appreciate the opportunity to give this invited talk as part of the TESOL ITA-IS webinar series. In my talk, I will primarily focus on sharing some insights from research on ITA instructional discourse to then demonstrate how we at Iowa State have translated them to our institutional ITA program assessment and language support practices. As ITA professionals, we're all aware of the challenges related to ITA assessment and training. Apart from this being a very costly endeavor in terms of expertise, labor, and resources, we need to make sure that we assess ITA's English language ability as needed for effective academic and instructional communication. So we're constantly seeking solutions and often trying to make use of information that's already available. With regards to ITA training, great variation in institutional practices as well as in ITA's teaching responsibilities make it challenging to design and exercise needs-responsive pedagogy. There are many questions we raise as we work towards addressing these challenges. The two questions that I posited a while back were, can we confidently use TOEFL IBT for ITA screening and certification? And how can we draw on authentic ITA discourse to inform ITA program practices? Let's start with TOEFL IBT. Speaking scores are often used for ITA screening, and that is a secondary use of the TOEFL IBT speaking test. Because the test scores need to be interpreted in relation to the target domain, that is, whether the speaking skills used in instructional context are indeed elicited by TOEFL tasks, we need to know how ITAs use language in their respective instructional domains. In other words, we need to be sure that the inferences we make from the TOEFL scores are generalizable to the speaking performance in instructional contexts. An important inference that has not been previously addressed in TOEFL validation research is related to what ITAs do with language when they perform instructional duties. How do they use language functionally for oral knowledge construction in their encounters with undergraduate students? As an applied linguist who oversees our institutional ITA practices, I was very much concerned with the lack of such evidence. This motivated me to address this gap through investigations of authentic ITA discourse, both for validation and linguistic description. And I approached both these angles through the knowledge framework. Let me give you a little background about the knowledge framework. It is anchored in the systemic functional linguistics tradition, or SFL for short. Theoretically, SFL forefronts the relationship between language and the purposes it serves in social environments. It defines functional language as language that is doing some job in some context. SFL construes the integration of linguistic form and functional meaning via three metafunctions: textual, interpersonal, and ideational. The ideational metafunction encompasses so-called knowledge structures, which is the key concept underpinning the knowledge framework. In short, this is a context-based approach that originated as a means of connecting language and thinking skills in content area instruction. The framework allows teachers to integrate language and content through 6 knowledge structures. They are conceptualized as dyadic pairs: classification and description, principles and sequence, and evaluation and choice. As summarized in this table, these pairs represent interrelated thinking skills indicative of theory-practice relation in terms of background knowledge and action knowledge. Each knowledge structure is associated with certain language features, which you can see in the last column. According to Mohan, the language features fall under particular types of language functions that are characteristic of each knowledge structure. Classification and description are language functions pertaining to the classification knowledge structure. Explanation, prediction, conclusion, and so on pertain to principles, and evaluation, judgment, criticism, and justification pertain to evaluation. And the same goes for the knowledge structures of description, sequence, and choice. However, if you look at the language features on the previous slides more closely, you will notice that the examples provided are not distinct enough to distinguish between different types of language functions and knowledge structures. For instance, features such as general reference, relational processes, and additive conjunction were listed as descriptive of classification and definition functions of the classification knowledge structure, as well as of description, comparison, contrast, quantification, and spatial order functions of the description knowledge structure. This is to say that while Mohan's description of knowledge structures has served its purpose when applied to teacher education, it was not conceptualized or designed for descriptive research purposes. Consequently, a substantial part of the research that I will transition to in a second focused on refining the knowledge framework so that it both enables the analysis of authentic ITA discourse and provides the kind of linguistic description we need in our ITA practices. Now I will transition to research on ITA discourse. One source of data for this research was a corpus of ITA discourse collected from 52 ITAs in 16 disciplines who were serving as lab assistants, recitation leaders, or sole course instructors. In genre terms, their discourse was representative of three respective curriculum genres: lab, recitation, and lecture. The composition of each curriculum genre is presented in this table per discipline. Overall, the size of the corpus was 119 texts, with a total word count of more than 300,000 words. Another data set was a TOEFL IBT speech corpus, which included almost 3,000 speech samples from 481 speakers of 42 languages. This corpus was representative of both independent and integrated responses from the TOEFL IBT speaking section. As I said a bit earlier, the original knowledge framework was not specific enough. Therefore, the first way in which these corpora were used was for the purpose of refining the framework. Having extracted a large sample of text from both corpora, our research team engaged in qualitative analysis of functional segments, working together to accomplish the tasks listed on this slide. As a result, we devised a framework that was pretty refined. It is specific to the functions of ITA discourse in the three curriculum genres that are most frequent in teaching appointments, or at least at Iowa State. As you see underlined in this table, new functions were identified, exemplifying in the knowledge structure of description, conceiving ideas in evaluation, and making choices, presenting options, expressing desire, advising, and presenting arguments in choice. Most importantly, the refined framework is much more specific as it contains descriptors of functional realizations and examples of language use for each language function, making them clearly distinguishable. As you can see here, classifying can be realized by arranging concepts in sets, classes, categories pertaining to a broader group, by placing concepts in an aggregate set, group, class, or category, and so on. In the third column in this table, you can see examples of linguistic instantiations of all these functions. I have a separate slide for the language functions in each knowledge structure, but I will let you pause and take time to go through them. It's a lot of information there. This slide shows the language functions and the linguistic instantiations of the description knowledge structure. Here are the functions and instantiations of principles. Similar descriptors for sequence, then for evaluation, and finally the language functions and linguistic instantiations of choice. This detailed framework allowed for the next research phase, and that is the annotation of the ITA and TOEFL speech corpora. The annotation protocol contains separate guidelines for segmentation and annotation, the unit of analysis being the finite clause. You might want to pause again here to look more closely at this screenshot because it exemplifies an excerpt from an annotated text. 3 annotators were involved in this phase. The reliability was calculated both for segmentation, that is determining unit boundaries, and for annotation, that is applying the knowledge structure and language function codes. Once annotated, the corpus data were extracted to create multiple combinations of datasets. As shown in the top figure, the datasets were extracted per corpus, per subsets within each corpus, and per text. These datasets were then subject to several frequency-based analyses, which are depicted in the bottom figure. The descriptive analysis provided results indicating the distribution of the knowledge structures and language functions. The multivariate correspondence analysis was employed to examine the relative associations among the subsets of the two corpora, and the knowledge framework categories. And the n-gram analysis, or analysis of multi-word sequences, provided insights about the language choices that were used to instantiate specific functional meaning. It is beyond the scope of this talk to report the results in full, and I don't want you to get bored, so I'm going to share some key insights only. As shown in this figure, all 6 knowledge structures were observed in all 3 curriculum genres. The frequencies of the knowledge structures were similar across lab, recitation, and lecture discourse, but sequence was the most frequent. You can see some linguistic instantiation examples here as well. No significant differences were found for the frequencies of language functions in each curriculum genre. Not surprisingly, though, instructing was the most prominent function. Although the ITAs employed a variety of functions, 3 other were notably predominant: evaluating, describing, and expressing opinions. Again, I have examples of linguistic instantiations on the side. Moving on to the correspondence analysis results, some strong associations were detected. The narrower the angle in this figure, the stronger the association. Recitation discourse was strongly associated with classification and lab discourse with evaluation. As for language functions, recitation was strongly associated with classifying, lab with specifying ends, and lecture with narrative, which, when you think about it, makes sense. The figure on this slide shows bootstrap consensus trees resulting from the analysis of trigrams identified in each knowledge structure. The colors represent the curriculum genres. The most straightforward observation here is that the genre branches cluster together based on the same knowledge structure categories. For example, Lab KS1, Recitation KS1, and Lecture KS1 form the cluster, which means that the n-grams of KS1 classification were similar across these genres. The same can be said about the n-grams pertaining to the other 5 knowledge structures. The table below exemplifies the 3-word sequences characteristic of each knowledge structure. So what can be concluded so far? The curriculum genres employed almost all language functions, yet more frequently using a similar set of functional categories such as instructing, evaluating, describing, expressing opinions, predicting, indicating order, indicating process, and explaining. At the same time, the curriculum genres show different levels of strength in their associations with different functional categories, which distinguish them from one another. Also, the n-grams in ITA discourse appear to be very similar irrespective of the genre. Apparently, they depend on the knowledge structure that underlie the organization of pedagogic discourse. Now, how does ITA discourse compare with TOEFL IBT speaking responses? Well, all 6 knowledge structures were identified in both corpora. However, classification was rarely used both by ITAs and TOEFL test takers. Description, evaluation, and choice were relatively equally distributed, but a detectable difference surfaced in the use of principles and sequence. The former was more prominent in the TOEFL IBT speech corpus, and the latter was more prominent in the ITA speech corpus. This figure shows the perceptual map of strong and moderate associations among the knowledge structures and the corpus subsets. The colors mark the pairs that are closely related to each other. Blue indicates a strong association for principles and TOEFL tasks 3, 4, 5, and 6. Pink, a moderate association for classification and recitation and lecture. Green for sequence and lab, and orange for evaluation and TOEFL tasks 1 and 2. Looking at language functions, the key finding is that instructing is one of the most frequent functions in ITA discourse, but very rarely elicited by TOEFL tasks. Further correspondence analysis results clearly discriminated between the ITA discourse and the TOEFL responses, as it is indicated by the vertical red line in this figure. The figure is a perceptual map of the relationships between the corpus subsets and the top 18 language functions. Not all 29 were included because they were much less frequent. So this perceptual map shows that the language functions in ITA discourse are not strongly associated with those elicited by TOEFL speaking tasks. Finally, the same can be said about the linguistic instantiations, which do not cluster together as we see in these figures. If TOEFL tasks were to elicit functional language choices similar to ITA discourse, the branches representing the TOEFL and ITA data would have clustered together, similar to the only triangle overlaid on ITA KS1 and TOEFL KS1 under trigrams. These comparative results suggest two takeaways. First, the knowledge structures and the language functions elicited by TOEFL IBT speaking tasks are comparative to those identified in ITA discourse in terms of frequency. However, there are also important differences. Specifically, TOEFL tasks do not elicit instructing, and the language choices used to instantiate the functions are different from those characteristic of curriculum genres. Considering the takeaways from this research overall, there are clear implications for ITA assessment and training. Developers and administrators of ITA tests need to think carefully about the construct. What is it that their tests are actually assessing? If functional language is not part of the construct, quite a few things would need to be reconsidered, including the actual test items. Similarly, the ITA language courses and training programs would need to incorporate practice using functional language in target curriculum genres. Segueing from these implications, let me switch from research to practice now. Here at Iowa State, the ITA program is part of the Center for Communication Excellence, which is housed in the Graduate College. As you can see, we have a number of different programs. The ITA program delivers the Oral English Certification Test, OECT for short, and based on OECT scores, ITAs are placed in level-based English for Teaching Purposes courses, which are graduate studies courses. So the implications that I mentioned a bit earlier definitely apply to how we test and instruct our ITAs. Our institutional OECT assessment consists of an oral proficiency interview, OPI, and a teach simulation. The assessment criteria include linguistic competence, content, context, type, functions, and sociolinguistic ability. As you can see, function has always been part of our OPI, but prior to the research I talked about earlier, the functions drew primarily on the actual OPI guidelines. The ITA courses focused on pronunciation, segmentals, suprasegmentals, and linguistic compensation teaching and presentation strategies tailored to proficiency levels. But if we are to assess ITAs in a valid way and help them successfully perform their teaching duties, we need to consider an important aspect, and that is the target language domain. Informed by the research results, we made substantial changes to our practices. To be more precise, we integrated the language functions in the construct definition, test specifications, test items, and test sets, as well as our radar training. Our courses now also integrate language functions in instructional materials, practice tasks, and assignments. The revised construct definition for the OECT now emphasizes function as a central language ability of what needs to be assessed. The OECT test specifications include a wide range of functions that are aligned with knowledge structures and language functions. I provided some examples of this alignment here on the slide. Convey abstract and complex ideas aligns with evaluation conceiving ideas. Explore hypotheses aligns with principles, hypothesizing, and predicting, and so on and so forth. The OPI test items are also based on the knowledge structures and language functions. The first example prompt in this table, for instance, states, some traditions are becoming less popular. What are some ways to encourage new generations to preserve and revive the traditions of their culture? What are some ways elicits the language of presenting options. The role play situation example below integrates several language functions, describing, explaining, narrating, and indicating order. Here you see an example of an item set designed to follow the OPI stages of level checks and probes, and to equip raters with prompts for each level based on the different knowledge structures and language functions. Actually, you might want to pause here again and take a closer look at the items. Maybe we can talk more about this during the Q&A session. As I'm sure many of you do, we train and certify raters. Our OECT rater training comprises a self-paced component and live ratings. The 4 modules of the self-paced training include functional language as a key topic integrated in learning about the assessment criteria, response solicitation, and test specifications. Before I conclude, I'd like to mention that we provide a range of language development opportunities for our ITAs and international students in general. I already mentioned our English for Teaching Purposes courses and that they now integrate a focus on language functions in instructional materials, activities, and assessments. Here are a few examples from materials designed to teach term definition strategies. Another very popular resource for our ITA's language development is individual tutoring with English-speaking consultants. Like OECT raters, our consultants undergo training before they are certified. In a nutshell, this diagram shows the tutoring model going from needs analysis in the first two sessions with the students to a cycle of targeted practice and assessment. Functional language use is integrated as part of pragmatics both in consultant training and in the tutoring sessions. More recently, we started working on creating open educational resources, and I will take a second here to put in a plug for the new edition of the Oral Communication for Non-Native Speakers of English book. This OER is not anchored in the research that I talked about today, but it is open access, and I think many of you will find it useful for your work with ITAs. To wrap up, I would like to acknowledge the financial support from the Educational Testing Service, as much as the contributions of my research team, and Dr. Lily Compton, who is the lead of our ITA program. Here is the list of references I mentioned today in case you want to follow up on those. And at this point, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to watch this presentation. I am looking forward to an inspiring Q&A session. Thank you.